We're really excited to walk you through all of the key findings from the report today. Before we do that, I do want to start with a little bit of background. How DAFs work. We want to review with you what DAFs are, how they work, and the key point is that donor advice funds are charitable giving accounts that are held by DAF sponsoring organizations. So DAF sponsoring organizations are the data we gathered for this report. When a donor makes a gift into these accounts, they receive an immediate tax deduction. And then the DAF sponsor manages and invests the funds. So the DAF sponsor is going to retain those advisory privileges and then will advise the sponsor to make grants to charities locally, nationally, of their choice over time. The Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative was really founded to conduct empirical research on this giving vehicle to enhance our public understanding of donor advised funds. So we really think that getting a better sense of this kind of growing and new vehicle is essential for the sector. And so that's especially a reason that we were pleased to be taking over the report. As a collaborative, we value transparency, we value objectivity, we value collaboration. And so over the past 7 years, we've gathered and utilized data from multiple avenues and have published a variety of academic and practitioner-focused research on donor advised funds. All of that is contained on our website, dafresearchcollaborative.org. And so therefore, we'll be linking to those pieces throughout our time today. You can see our full report there, as well as a lot of the other work we've done. Today, though, we are discussing the annual DAF report, which reports on the aggregate DAF sponsor data across the United States. Throughout the presentation, you'll hear from each of us in turn, but before that happens, I'd love to give a quick minute for each of those lead researchers on the report to introduce themselves and their institution. You've already heard from me. Let's turn it over to Dan Heist.
Hi, everyone. Dan Heist. I'm on the faculty at Brigham Young University and just happy to be with you today. Jeff?
Hi, everyone. Jeff Williams with the Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. Jen.
Jen Shaker, faculty at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and happy to be with you and on the team. Hand it to Rachel.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Rachel Sumsion. I'm the founder of ImpactWise LLC and also happy to be here today. So with that, I'll turn it back to Danielle.
Thank you, everybody. Acknowledgements. Before we jump into the next portion, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsoring partners. This report would not have been possible without all of these organizations' generous support. You can see everyone's logos here. I'd also like to recognize members of our research team, including Kendra Stone, the staff at the Johnson Center of Philanthropy, and several of the graduate students at DePaul University and Brigham Young University who have helped tremendously with the report. I even see some of you on the group today. So thank you all so much for your work and your support of this report. We really couldn't have done this without you. It really takes a village. It's been a team effort throughout this process, and we appreciate the support partially because we do know this is such an important report for the sector, and we really wanted to do it justice and keep it going in the spirit that it was started. So this year, we've been doing a lot of new things, and I wanted to highlight a few of those changes before we delve in. So in line with our commitment to transparency, to open science, we have pre-registered our analysis. That means we publicly documented all of our methods before we began analyzing the data to strengthen our rigor and transparency. We also did some work refining how we classify DAF sponsor subtypes. So the overall classification is going to look familiar. We've got our national sponsors, we've got our community foundations, we've got our single issue sponsors. But we've also kind of done some work grouping folks within those categories to really look through meaningful differences. And Rachel will walk through some more of that shortly. Another change is that for the first time, we made the underlying data set used in this report publicly available. So you will be able to see all of our sponsor list, which was developed through extensive vetting by our many research assistants and our PIs. Our whole team worked on this, and releasing it allows others to help improve its accuracy. actually, this transparency is already paid off. And so one of the things that we have encouraged folks to do is to look through that sponsor list just to help us continue to refine and improve the accuracy of that sponsor list. And so we've actually already identified some sponsors that should be part of that list that didn't make the report this year. We think some of that was due to the recent closures and atypical gaps, I will say, in some of the reporting, particularly related to the federal shutdown and some of the IRS delays over the last couple of years. And so I'd really encourage folks to continue to take a look at the sponsors on that list. And if you let us know if you see any sponsors that are missing that should be included that are not currently on that list, and we will make sure to continue to add an update. On a related note, we are implementing a new supplemental update at the end of Q1 this year. And so folks will be able to see updates to the data, both from new sponsors that we discovered through this process and also through some of the updated IRS filings that have taken place in the last couple of months. Based on how these things typically go, we don't expect to see a big shift, maybe 1%, 2% there in the various numbers. And we did some initial analysis, and we do think that even with the new releases from the IRS, probably overall trends you see today will remain the same. Finally, we have now completed and written an Advancing Philanthropy article that we're excited to be able to share in the next few months that will be released through Advancing Philanthropy and AFP, and that will include a lot of different notes that we have and kind of suggestions for how fundraisers can use the data in this report. So be sure to take a look out for that. We'll be linking to that on our website as well when that is publicly released. With that context, I'll turn the time over to Rachel to go over the data and methods in the report.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle, for that great introduction. So I'll take us through the data and methods. I know you're all here for the findings, but we'll get some good context for you all before we dive in. So first things first, the data for the annual DAF report comes from publicly available Schedule D information from Form 990s, like Danielle foreshadowed. DAF sponsors are required to fill this schedule out every year. And so we access these files primarily through the Giving Tuesday Schedule D data mart. In cases where the information wasn't there that we were looking for, we would look at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy's 990 database. And then in some cases, we even called sponsors directly and said, can we have your most recent information, please? That was a great process. And like Danielle mentioned, we spent a long time vetting organizations to choose what organizations we were pulling their data for. Part of this reason that we're doing this is because some organizations will file a Schedule D even if they are not a DAF sponsor. Some organizations get a DAF grant and file a Schedule D thinking that they need to, but we went through that list to try to weed some of those folks out and make sure everyone included in the report is an actual DAF sponsor. As Danielle mentioned, something that we're super excited about this year is that we introduced some subtypes to the groupings of DAF sponsors. So in previous iterations of the report, we have the classifications of national sponsors, community foundations, and single issue charities. And those categories remain the same, right? We have national sponsors that don't have a defined geographic or cause area focus. Our community foundations do have that geographic focus, and our single issue charities do have that cause area focus. But then we introduced a few subtypes in the national and single issue charity sections. So moving on now to the national sponsor subtypes. We wanted to define these groups for you all so you get a good sense of what these groups are. So the standard national sponsors are nonprofits that are primarily focused on administering DAFs. Some familiar examples for you all might include Fidelity Charitable, DAF Giving 360, NPT, National Philanthropic Trust, REN, Vanguard Charitable, a lot of these big names that you might be familiar with. Donation processors, on the other hand, are nonprofits that are focused on facilitating large-scale or complex giving. Donation processor DAFs are often used for workplace giving, and other kinds of specialized mass online giving. Typically, this means that accounts at donation processors are very small in comparison to what you might think about as at a typical DAF, and are often established by a corporation. So there's often a lot of accounts at a donation processor You can think about a company going to a DAF sponsor and setting up a given account for every single one of their employees at the company. So this is a very distinct, different type of DAFs that we're pulling out in the analyses for this report. Next, moving on to the single issue charity subtypes, we have 3 different groups that we pulled out. We looked at the religiously affiliated sponsors, higher education and healthcare sponsors, and other single issue charities. They're pretty self-explanatory, but the religiously affiliated sponsors are folks with a focus on religion or the practice or advancement of religion or spirituality. Higher education and healthcare focus on education and health services. And then this other group is any other single issue charity that's focused on a specific cause outside of those 2 realms. The report currently includes data for 99 national sponsors, 788 community foundations, and 598 single issue charities. And as Danielle mentioned, we're really excited that this data for the report is publicly available on the DAFRC's website. So you could go download it today if you wanted to, and kind of look through that sponsor list. The next slide shows a little bit of a breakdown of the DAF sponsored types and subtypes. So as you can see here, the orange represents the nationals, and then the green represents the community foundations, and the blues represent single issue charities. The main takeaway I'm finding here is that the majority of DAF sponsors are these community foundations with a specific geographic focus, which is really interesting. Lastly, before we dive into the results, we have a few considerations to keep in mind in the spirit of transparency. First off, sponsors operate on different fiscal years, right? We have some organizations whose fiscal year ends in June and others that ends in December and everything in between, right? And so the data in the report does not reflect the same 12-month period for everything that is in there. Second off, we use current dollars in the report. So the data in the report is not adjusted for inflation. I have a little side note slide here that shows us the use of, or the average annual inflation rate from 2019 to 2024. That helps kind of contextualize these trends, right? We have COVID in here. We have a few different crazy things going on. So just so you all know, this is kind of in the background underlying the data. The last consideration, we'll go back to that slide, is that we do have some imputed data in the report. This has been part of a report for a long time, just due to the filing timing for IRS data, right? Organizations have a little while to report their filings to the IRS, and then the IRS takes a little while themselves to process this data before it's released to the public. So if we were to wait until every single piece of data was completely final, it'd be well into 2026 before we could get any kind of snapshot of the 2024 data numbers. And so because of this, we took all the data that we did have that was available and put it into the report. And then any missing data at the end of that, we use an imputation process to make our best estimate for the 2024 data. This data will be updated as those filings become available. And so a good way to think about this year's report is this 2024 data is our best estimation for 2024, and next year's report will have those final non-imputed numbers for 2024. So with that, I'll turn the time over now to Dan to walk through our results.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really good context to understand the findings. We're going to start with the number of accounts, number of donor advised fund accounts that are out there among those roughly 1,500 sponsoring organizations. So as you can see, in 2024, we had about an 18% increase in DAF accounts, up to roughly 3.6 million DAFs. For those who are familiar with previous versions of the MPT report, this is going to seem a lot higher than has previously been reported. You can see in 2022, we found a large increase in donor advised funds accounts, and they are coming predominantly from donation processors. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit here in just a sec, but I wanted to give you the overall trend of the number of DAF accounts among all types of DAFs. The next one thing to keep in mind here is that the growth in DAFs has come from these donation processors that we'll look at in just a sec. But the growth among kind of our traditional DAFs, or those who are not donation processors, has actually slowed down a little bit over the last 4 years. So as the growth increases on overall DAFs, the growth percentage among those not including donation processors has slowed down just a little bit. So this next slide is going to show you the difference between donation processors and standard national donor advised funds. If we could go to the next slide, there we go. So what we're seeing here in the yellow are the standard, or sorry, the donation processors. You can see how the growth in number of accounts is really being driven by this particular subtype of donor advised funds. The orange are the standard national DAFs that Rachel talked about earlier, that we typically think of when we think of national donor advised funds. And so the really big jump came in 2022 when we saw almost a million, over a million donor advised funds being added in just 1 year. And so this is a really big trend that is important to understand as we look at the history of donor advised funds. In the next slide, we're going to look at growth in donor advised funds accounts in community foundations. So the trend continues to be upwards for a number of donor advised fund accounts at community foundations, over 100,000 accounts in 2024. But this is a relatively slower growth rate compared to other types of DAFs, with about a 4.4% growth rate over these 5 years. We'll take a look at the different types of single issue charities. So again, here what you're seeing is a breakout of the different subtypes of single issue charities. We're seeing over 100,000 donor advised fund accounts at single issue charities. The bulk of those are at the dark blue. That's religiously affiliated organizations. We do see a small slice of those at higher ed and healthcare organizations, and then the rest of them in that light blue is coming from other types of single issue charities. So we're going to move on now to contributions. So this is, again, money that's coming into donor advised funds in each fiscal year. In 2024, the contributions in the DAFs rebounded strongly compared to the kind of downturn in 2023. So contributions reached nearly $90 billion in 2024. We think that this reflects the growth in the stock market in 2023, 2024 calendar years. And then the downturn in 2023 was as a result of the reduction in contributions in 2023 was a result of the downturn in the stock market in 2022. So we think that what's happening with contributions is the contributions are following pretty closely to the stock market performance. So we'll look at some of the different types and subtypes here. When we look at national organizations, again, the orange is the standard national DAF sponsors. The yellow are those donation processors. So you can see that even though there were a lot more accounts at the donation processors, that the vast majority of the money is coming into the standard national DAFs. And so again, almost $69 billion of contributions into national DAFs in 2024, rebounding from that about $50 billion in 2023. We'll look at contributions into community foundations now. Again, we're seeing a similar pattern of rebounding in 2024. As with the other types of donor advised funds, again, we think this is related to the stock market performance during this time. These are the numbers, about $13 billion of contributions into community foundations. We'll look now at single issue charities. These are the breakdowns of the different subtypes of single issue charities. We saw another increase, about a 20% increase in contributions in 2024, up from 2023. So a little bit over $8 billion of contributions into single issue charities. Again, the vast majority of that, which kind of aligns with the number of accounts, is at religiously affiliated organizations. So think Jewish federations and other types of religiously affiliated organizations are receiving the vast majority of those contributions. So I want to take a little pause right now and show you an important statistic that we think is important to include as part of this report. What we're looking at here is the percentage of contributions into DAFs as a percentage of total charitable giving as recorded by Giving USA, and as a percentage of total individual giving as recorded by Giving USA. And so what we're seeing is a trend upwards, that the percent of both total giving and individual giving that's first going into donor advised funds is increasing year over year. So we see about 15% of all giving was going into DAFs in 2024, and about 23% of individual giving was first going into DAFs in 2024. So I'll turn the time over to Jen now, who's going to talk about grant making from DAFs.
So much, Dan, and hello, everyone. Happy to be with you. We've been talking about assets and contributions into DAF accounts. So let us now talk about the money flowing out of those accounts through grants. And so we'll begin by talking about grants overall. That is across all of the sponsor types. And as you can see on this slide, grant making is at an all-time high. And the trend in grant making has been up, showing us that DAF grants are relatively resistant to economic factors, and that they have also showed resilience in the face of crises, as shown by some of the other research done by the DAFRC. So if you look at fiscal year 24 in particular, DAF donors recommended an estimated 65 billion in grants. So this was a 19% increase in the recommendations and grant making from the prior fiscal year. So thinking about 2024 here again, that rate of growth that we saw in that 1 year period is much larger than what we saw between 22 and 23, and also larger between 21 and 22. And so overall, when looking at the past 5 years, the compound annual growth rate has been about 16.5%. So we see that upward trajectory in the numbers and in the visuals on this slide. So let's now talk just about national sponsors. And so recalling this is the combination of our traditional national sponsors and our donation processors. And I know there's been a lot of questions about donation processors that we will come back to at the end of the session. But in the meantime, you can see here that the total granted from those two types of sponsor was about 44 billion in 2024. Let's go to the next slide. On community foundations. So grants from these sponsors reached an estimated 12.5 billion in 2024, which was a little bit of a dip from what happened the prior year. So remember, these are the most numerous of the types of sponsors, but they don't necessarily grant the most. Thinking more about community foundations, we'll go to the next slide. We'll talk more about them later, but we'll go to the next slide now and talk about single issue charities. So DAFs at single issue charities, those charities focusing on a more narrow framework for where they make their grants, gave out about $8.5 billion in 2024. This was a big jump from the year before so this was a 33% increase in grant making from just the year before. And this was actually more was granted out than actually had been contributed the year before. So a lot of activity at these single issue charities. And as you can see from the dark blue that takes up more than the majority of the grant making, that most of this was coming out of those religiously affiliated sponsors. So Let's move now and talk about the assets. And so that is the money that is being held in the accounts. So thinking about what might contribute to asset growth. So why do DAF assets grow? They grow because new accounts are opened, new contributions are made into existing accounts. And remember, we saw that contributions were especially high in the time frame of this report. And they also grow because assets are retained and grow themselves. So we know that from some of our other research that DAF donors adopt different strategies when giving or granting through their DAF. Some donors put as much money into their accounts as they're going to grant out right away or in the near future and move money in and out quickly. Others put more sizable contributions into their DAF account and plan to grant it out over a period of time, say 2, 3, 5 years. And then some DAF donors treat them almost like a personal endowment, where they grant out a percentage of the principal that they are holding in their account, really taking a long time strategy in how they want to deploy their philanthropy. So each of these types of strategies has a different effect on asset levels and payout rates, which will be discussed in the next section. So let's talk now a little bit about those assets overall in 2024. Looking back to 2020, the assets have nearly doubled in that 5-year period, and the assets have grown 28% just in the last year. So the performance of the stock market during the report period really helps explain that growth. So just in 2023, 2024, the stock market rose 23 to 24%. Lots of 23 and 24s in there. But you can see that that is not too much different from that growth of 28% that we saw in that same period. Let's break it down a little bit more into our categories. And so if we're looking just at the national sponsors, their assets equaled 237 billion in 2024. Vast majority of that held at the traditional sponsors rather than the donation processors, which are in yellow, and a very small slice at the top of the orange, kind of hard to see on this slide. All right, so let's talk now about community foundations, our second type of sponsor. And so the assets at community foundations reached a new high of 65 billion in 2024. They grew 16% from the prior year. And this rate of growth in the last year was almost twice as much as the rate of growth over the past 5 years. So this increase is partially tied to the dramatic jump in contributions at community foundations that you saw earlier in the presentation. One more type of sponsor to look at, and that is our single issue charities. And their total DAF assets in 2024 was an estimated 25 billion. So here again, the religiously affiliated sponsors are holding the vast majority of the assets. The relatively significant amount of assets in higher ed, that's about $3+ billion, is interesting considering that there aren't really that many accounts held at those types of sponsors, just around 3,000. So quite a few assets, a limited number of accounts when it comes to healthcare and higher education. With that, I will turn the microphone, the virtual microphone, over to Jeff, and he will take us through our remaining sections.
Very good. Thank you, Jen. We'll start by a quick tour through the payout rate. It's one of the key findings and questions we get whenever we present information about DAFs. We'll begin with the payout rate overall. Again, our calculation method in this report takes the current year grants and divides that by the prior year-end assets. That's the teal line on this chart. And for transparency, we'll show kind of two other methods that are frequently used. Those are the other two lines, the like heavier dotted orange and lighter dotted orange, I guess, on this chart, so you can see the different methods. As we've seen in our prior reports, kind of no matter which way you calculate it, those payout rates fall within a reasonably close band of each other. Using our preferred payout rate calculation, that teal line, aggregate payout rate of all DAFs, all types in 2024 was about 25%. Again, this is a look at everything in aggregate. It does not capture variation at the individual account level. If you're curious about individual account level information and payout rates, that's our other national study, the one that was published in 2024, that looked at the 3-year payout rates at an individual account level basis. When we look at that individual account level basis, we find that the median payout rate was 9%, and the 3-year average was 18. So just combining everything, if you look at transaction basis, individual account basis, that average payout rate's around 18%. If instead you look from Schedule D, like in this report, the average payout rate is about 25%. Let's look in detail at each of the different types. Here's nationals. Overall payout rate in this study for national sponsors, very close to the overall at 24.8%. That's about a point and a half higher than it was in 2023. Payout rate at donation processors has consistently been over 100%, which makes this graph a little interesting to look at. And just a quick explanation of how that can happen. Donate money in donation processor sponsored DAFs flows in and out really, really quickly. So consider a DAF at a workplace that might have a year-end balance of $100. Over the course of the following years, and I'm an employee, I have $5 or $10 or $20 taken out of every paycheck. That happens 12 or 20 times a year. So pretty quickly you can see that I might have $500 that I deposit in my DAF, $500 that flies out the door to that charity, and my ending balance is $100 or $20. That example of $500 out and $100 balance, that's where you can see a payout rate, especially in donation processors, of 200, 300, 500, 800%. That's what pulls that average really high up. Community foundations payout rate, average at community foundations in 2024, about 22.3%, just a smidge lower than the rate in 2023, also just a little bit lower than the overall average payout rate. Possible explanation here is that community foundation donors may be more likely to take a longer-term approach to giving. We also have to note that there are some community foundations that in their rules for DAFs kind of treat them almost like an endowment. So there's a natural rate limit in the payout rate for some DAFs held at community foundations. Payout rates at single issue charities, higher than the average, 36.5% in 2024. It's about 11 points higher than the overall average. This is one where we're still looking at what's driving this higher level. One of our hypotheses is it's related to the more mission-focused giving patterns, especially of those religiously affiliated single-issue sponsors. In contrast, we're seeing a little bit lower payout rates among higher education and healthcare sponsors that, again, we're suspecting might be related to the presence of endowed accounts, especially among higher ed institutions that we know are out there from our other research. Last, just a comparison of DAFs and private foundations. This is a question we get quite frequently. As you can see here, if we're talking averages to averages, the average payout rate of a DAF at 25.3%, markedly higher than the average payout rate, according to the latest study out there, from private foundations at about 8.1%. However, while this is mathematically an apples to apples comparison, we argue this is not an apples to apples comparison in terms of the intent of these different vehicles. Many, many private foundations are permanent, or their endowments are to last a perpetuity. Many, many DAFs, we know from our prior research, do not have a perpetual time frame. So this is kind of a little bit of an apples to oranges in terms of mission or purpose, even though the math is the same when we do the calculations between these two groups. Last, we'll just flip over to average account size. And here, this is one where a couple of us on the DAF team, we recognize that many people want to talk average account size, but we really don't like the statistics because, again, this is Schedule D. It's at the sponsor level. It's not those individual accounts. So we present it here for consistency with prior reports over time. This average account size is heavily influenced by a very small number of very, very large accounts. So we just want to make sure everyone interprets this with caution. Just for context, in the national study of DAFs, where we have that account and transaction data, we find that half of all DAF accounts have total assets under 50,000, and fewer than 1 in 20 DAFs had accounts over a million. So again, that average is really thrown off by some big, small number of DAFs with some really large balances. Account size overall in this DAF account report was about $92,000 in 2024. That's a significant drop since 2022 in terms of average account size, primarily explained by those donation processors and the rapid growth in the number of accounts in donation processors, even though it's a small number of overall dollar value. Account size at the Nationals, just over $70,000, so in the ballpark of the overall average. How this breaks down between the donation processors and standard Nationals, we've included that in the technical appendix to the overall report. Again, just caveating a second time, the average account statistic is heavily influenced by a small number of very large accounts. That also means the reverse is true. Here you can see the effect of having all those donation processor counts open in 2022, which dramatically lowered the average. When you add 5 or 6 or 700,000 accounts in a single year, that average is going to really jump around. Community Foundation's average size, here we see a much different number, about $639,000. Larger average account size than the other sponsor types, again, likely driven by the presence of some extremely large accounts held at Community Foundation sponsors. We see a similar thing, just not quite the same magnitude if we look at single issue charities. Again, $90,000 overall average, single issue charities, that jumps to $223,000. With that, I'll turn the time back over to Danielle to just remind us of some of our key findings and flip over to start answering a number of the questions that have been submitted. Danielle. Oops, Danielle, I think you are on mute.
Just answering some folks' questions here in the chat and getting all that queued up for us. I hope I'm unmuted now. Just answering some questions in the chat, getting all that keyed up for us. Yes, so here are really the key takeaways. We see 1,485 DAF sponsors in this report, managing 3.5 million accounts. We see contributions increasing to that almost $90 billion range. We see grants increasing to 65 billion nearly, and assets increasing to 326 billion. So increases across the board. We are really happy to have kind of summarized that here today. And now I'm ready to start to bring some of our questions for the team. Let's put everyone back on the chat or on the screen. There we go. Thank you all. So we have a lot of questions about donation processors. Dan, could you give us just a brief overview once again of kind of what donation processors are and how we should be thinking about them kind of in the context? Are they the thing we should be spending most of our time thinking about? Are they a bit of a red herring? How would you characterize donation processors?
Yeah, for the most part, donation processors are organizations that are set up to handle charitable giving on a platform where people will be kind of making, sometimes it's just one-time donation, sometimes it's ongoing donations. Again, a couple of the prominent types of donation processors are workplace giving. So you have a workplace giving account that you get a little bit of your paycheck every month into your giving account, and you give out of that. Sometimes these are donation processors are handling transactions, for special events, that kind of thing. And so what we're seeing is even though these are very kind of different types of charitable giving, that they are still using the donor advised fund um, uh, kind of model as defined by the IRS, and they're still filling out this Schedule D with the IRS. And so because they are still classified by the IRS as a donor advised fund, and because they're still filling out the same schedule, we are including them here, even though it is a very different type of philanthropy that they are facilitating.
We did get a question, were these missing from previous reports? No, they were not missing from previous reports. There's really two things happening here. One is that part of the definition that MPT always uses is they have to be in existence for a certain number of years to start to be included in the report to kind of it was one way of handling some problems with people's filings. Sometimes people will file as a DAF for just a single year and then and change something, and we think most of those were errors. So one way of kind of making sure the folks in the report were real DAFs is to say they have to have been filing with the IRS for at least 4 years as a DAF, 3 or 4 years. And so some of these are just a newer giving vehicle that is becoming increasingly popular. So that's most of a lot of what we're seeing here is in terms of they weren't so much missing in the report previously as they were new enough that they weren't meeting the criteria previously is the best of my understanding. And then kind of more typical DAF sponsors, right? So donation processes are just one type of sponsor. So more typical DAF sponsors would be community foundations, national sponsors, standard national sponsors, single issue sponsors, and similar. So it's not another generic term for sponsors. It's a very specific type of sort of pass-through giving vehicle, is maybe how I'd explain it. Okay. Great. I would love to hear people's thoughts about the overall uptick. I think a couple of our questions are making that observation. What do we attribute this kind of overall uptick in DAF activity in 2024 to? Maybe Jeff, would you like to jump in on that?
I think a couple reasons jump to mind. One is, and I think it has to go in first position, is just stock market performance. Had a strong performance out of the pandemic. So we have to start with just simple growth of assets, really nothing about DAFs. It was really about the performance of investments. Second, though, I think as we're all kind of better understanding just the variety of different DAFs, I think DAFs, in a way, DAFs are kind of maturing as a model. And kind of the DAF that we all have in our mental model of this is what all DAFs look like, that growth rate is starting to slow, and we're starting to see things like those donation processors or DAFs at certain types of community foundations, even some types of nationals, really start to grow. And third, I think you're starting to see some other, I'll call them industries, meaning 10 years ago, as an individual donor, maybe when I thought of a DAF, I thought of my community foundation or a major national, and that's where my family would put our money to give to my local university or my alma mater. 10 years later, many higher ed institutions are now offering DAFs to be DAF sponsors on their own. I'll use the example of here in mid-Michigan. I know Michigan State University is now a DAF sponsor, white labeled through another provider, but they have the little tweak of you can put any amount of money in. You just have to promise that half of all of the grants by dollar value will go to Michigan State, and the other half can go anywhere in the world to any charitable purpose, just like any other sponsor. So I think that third reason is we're seeing a growth of those kind of really unique or special characteristic sponsors that, again, follow the same rules as the nationals, but they kind of don't match our almost outdated, in air quotes, view of what a DAF sponsor is.
Jen, could you talk us through kind of any of the relationship between overall increases in giving in 24 and donor advised fund increases instead of the big picture on giving in 2024? The in particular and similarly, what do we sort of expect in 2025?
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for that. And yes, thank you to Devin for the Go Hoosiers. I can't help but to see that in the Q&A. You notice I'm wearing some red today. Um, uh, just thinking about what might happen, I don't love conjecturing, but I think just in even a couple conversations, just even today with some DAF sponsors, they are telling us anecdotally that they've noticed an uptick in giving in from the DAF granting. I want to keep saying that, and that's a lesson for all of us and all of you to remember to think of these as grants because they're a little different. But anyway, they're noticing an uptick in their granting out of the DAFs in 2025. And, thinking about some of our other research, we had already been thinking and talking about bundling. And this is something that's been happening in charitable giving kind of in general, coming out of the changes in 2017, that donors are not necessarily giving on an annual cycle. Like we like to think about things every year, but donors might be thinking about things like what happens in 2 years when we think about those larger donors who are affected by changes in tax policy in particular. And so I think we've been kind of watching those patterns too that are evident in the national data of some bundling where people, and what I mean there is that people may do large amount of charitable giving in 1 year to make it worth itemizing getting the tax benefits and then do not do it in the next year, right? And then they might do it in the following year so that they can take advantage of the policy, the changing tax policies. So in general with charitable giving and what we are anticipating, we we have been seeing some kind of unpredictability the last few years, beginning in COVID, when we thought maybe people would give less and they gave more. And then coming out of that, when people kind of returned to how they were giving again. And so I think we've seen quite a bit of volatility in giving overall, and that some of the DAF trends and the increase in granting is, to me, reassuring that that money is following a somewhat more predictable pattern than some of what we've been seeing overall.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'll follow up by kind of answering one of the questions that we did get around community foundations. And they did see a slightly different trend in their grants in 2024 from some of the other groups. And I will contextualize that by saying one grants relate to assets and contributions. So one thing that we saw happening in 2023 was a huge decrease in contributions, which aligned with the problems in the stock market, the negative stock market trend at the end of 2022 in particular, and somewhat in the end of 2023, right? So the end of 2022 had a particularly large dip in the stock market. It then dropped contributions in 2023, in particular to community foundations. And so what that then did to granting from community foundations in 24 is that we don't see the same kind of upward trend in granting in community foundations in 2024 because they were so kind of depressed by the lack of contributions the prior year. Is one of the possibilities is what we are seeing there. We don't have more specific insight than that, but that is likely one of the things that may have been happening. So I think that you could then hopefully say, I think we are seeing a lot of anecdotal increases in contributions to DAFs this year and last year. So hopefully then the grant making follows it.
Yeah.
In the
Danielle, I'll just tack onto that, blue asked about the effect of the One Big Beautiful Bill. We are also hearing anecdotally from a lot of sponsors that they have seen an increase in contributions coming into the DAFs at the end of 2025 to try and take advantage of tax deductions and changes in standard deductions and limits and ceilings and all that. So we do think that there will be an increase in contributions into DAFs in 2025 as well.
And I'll just quickly add there for everyone, and we'll be able to prove that 2 years from now. Because remember, the 990s that would capture the end of 2025 donations aren't due to the IRS until May of 26. They typically take anywhere from 9 to 12 months to process out of there. So it could be May of 27 before we have that data in our hand, which would then fall in the November 27 report. So we will all collectively have is those anecdotes until we can start gathering enough of the 990s. And just remember, we're at least 6 or 9 months away from even getting the first peak at 990s to do kind of an apples to apples comparison of individual sponsors. So realistically, we're probably a good 12 or 18 months away from having data to say definitively, was there excess bundling? Was there a policy change or a reaction to the policy change by individual donors?
Wonderful. So there's a lot of other questions that sort of relate to fundraising from donor advised funds, and I'd love maybe one of our team to jump in there. And I know a lot of you, three of you, Rachel, Jen, and Dan, just released a report or in the middle of releasing a second report on fundraising from donor advised funds. What are some of the strategies, the things fundraisers should keep in mind when they're thinking about securing gifts from donor advised fund donors? Maybe Rachel, do you want to jump in with a couple of things here?
Yeah, for sure. So something that it would be great to go check out our recently released report on the website that we interviewed fundraisers specifically and asked them about how are they fundraising from DAF donors. But something to keep in mind when we're looking at this data in particular, right? This is like the aggregate DAF sponsor data that's really big numbers. It's almost like, how does this apply to my one donor that I know that might have a donor advised fund, right? It's basically what we want you to take away from this data it's a lot of things, right? But that DAFs are there, right? And that you can talk to your DAF donors about their use of a DAF and that it can work into their larger giving plan, right? When we talk to DAF donors, it's oftentimes that they have a DAF, but they also have their individual giving that they're just doing out of their checkbook or their credit card, or they have this or that strategy. And so as a fundraiser, it's important to understand what giving strategy might be beneficial for your donor and talk to them about would a DAF make sense for you at this point with this gift. Another great thing from this report is you could look at the list of DAF sponsors, right, that is publicly available and say, oh, what are the most common DAF sponsors in my area or for my cause area that I'm focused on? Am I seeing gifts coming in from these DAF sponsors? Are there people that I could talk to at that DAF sponsor to kind of coordinate and say, hey, how can I maybe get involved with some of your donors? There's lots of different kind of creative strategies that you could take when working with DAF donors, which is really exciting part of fundraising in this field of increasing DAFs in the US. So I don't know if Dan or Jen wants to add anything else to that. Awesome. Well, that's it.
There were some questions about disaggregating some of this information by age, by gender, by race. And one thing I'll just kind of remind folks about to keep in mind is that, when we collected this information, we were not getting insight into individual accounts. We do have another report, however, that does have that type of insight. It's data we only collect once every 5 years. And so we did release that in 2024. And so we do have quite a bit of those insights disaggregated by size, and by some other key metrics. And so you can take a look at that on our website. We'll drop that into the chat. But we not only talk about just aggregating some of this information, we also are able to provide some information about kind of the typical DAF account holder. And to supplement that even further, we have a donor survey that we completed in 2025, which allowed us to kind of survey folks at a variety of DAFs. We were able to ask about their motivations. We were able to ask about more about their age, about their succession planning, a plethora of other topics that I'm sure you'll find very interesting. And that is also available on our website. Anything else that folks want to highlight from those or those two previous pieces that I think ties in with the information or the questions we're getting in the chat?
I'll just flag in case participants are not paying attention to the chat. I did just drop in the links to both the 2024 National Account Level Study as well as the donor survey that Danielle was just mentioning.
There's also some policy questions in the chat, and I think there's people answering them even better than we could hear. Folks with a little bit more insight into Capitol Hill. And so I think those are largely being answered by folks in the chat. There's a question about, do DAFs allow alternative investment patterns and funds? Do we have any data about that? Impact investing, investing in other entities. Can someone just give a quick note about that? Maybe Dan?
Yeah, sure. I'll hop in here. Yeah, so when assets are inside the donor advised fund account before they're being granted out, they are invested. The most common types of investments are kind of the mutual funds, the types of things that you would expect if you had investments in a kind of a personal investment account. But we are seeing some folks using donor advised funds and the assets while they're being waited to be granted to take a little bit more of a proactive, pro-social approach to their investing, doing some impact investing, doing recoverable grants. And so that this is a kind of a ripe opportunity for folks to be doing some more kind of pro-social investing while the money is in the donor advised fund. So it's definitely a topic for more research. We don't currently have good data on that, but it is a topic that we'd like to look into in the near future.
And the most popular question is, what are we sharing after this? And we will be sharing the webinar recording rather than the slides. I think we just do a much better job giving context for all of these numbers when we include our commentary, and really will help everyone to get a great sense of how this report was put together and what you can expect from us going forward. All right, thank you all for your time, your attention, your questions, your answers to each other in the chat. I know we weren't able to get to all of these questions. We would love to be able to continue these conversations throughout the year. You are all now on our mailing list, and so you will be sure to hear about other possibilities to hear from us throughout 2026. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.